The dust had settled on another day in the town of Cedar Ridge, where the saloon doors swung with the rhythm of broken dreams and desperate hopes. It was here, in the amber glow of oil lamps and the haze of tobacco smoke, that Marcus Kane found himself standing at a crossroads that would forever alter the trajectory of his existence. Marcus had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 months prior, carrying nothing but the weight of his failures and a leather pouch containing his life savings, money earned through years of backbreaking labor on cattle drives and in mining camps across the unforgiving territories. At 32, he bore the weathered face of a man who had seen too much and believed in too little. His hands, calloused and scarred, told stories of honest work, but his eyes held the hollow look of a soul that had lost its way. The circumstances that brought him to this moment were as complex as they were tragic. Marcus had grown up as the youngest son of a struggling rancher in Texas, watching his father slowly lose everything to drought, disease, and the crushing weight of debt. When the bank finally claimed their land, Marcus had set out to make his own fortune, driven by a fierce determination to never again feel the helplessness that had consumed his family. For 15 years, he had wandered from job to job, town to town, always chasing the promise of something better but never quite finding it. It was during one of his lowest moments, sitting alone in the saloon on a particularly cold October evening, that Marcus overheard a conversation that would change everything. 2 men at the bar were discussing the arrival of a group of women from back east, women who had answered advertisements for mail-order brides but found themselves abandoned by their intended husbands upon arrival. With nowhere else to turn and no means of returning home, these women had fallen into desperate circumstances. Among them was Isabella Rodriguez, a 24-year-old woman whose story was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. She had traveled from a small town in Pennsylvania after responding to a letter from a man who claimed to own a successful ranch in Colorado. Upon her arrival, she discovered that the man had fled town after accumulating massive gambling debts, leaving behind only a note and the crushing reality that she had been deceived. With no family to return to and her savings exhausted from the journey west, Isabella found herself trapped in a situation that grew more dire with each passing day. The men at the bar spoke of these women with the casual callousness that characterized much of frontier life, treating their predicament as nothing more than an opportunity for exploitation. It was then that Marcus learned of the auction, a shameful spectacle in which these desperate women would be sold to men willing to pay their debts in exchange for marriage contracts. The very idea sickened him, yet he found himself unable to walk away from the knowledge of their suffering. Marcus had encountered Isabella only once before that fateful night, briefly in the general store where she had been attempting to purchase basic supplies with the few coins remaining in her possession. Even in her reduced circumstances, there was something about her that commanded attention, not just her striking beauty, with her dark hair and intelligent brown eyes, but a dignity and strength that seemed unbroken despite her desperate situation. She carried herself with a grace that spoke of education and refinement, qualities that seemed almost foreign in the rough environment of Cedar Ridge. As the night of the auction approached, Marcus found himself consumed by thoughts he couldn't quite understand. He had always prided himself on his self-reliance, on his ability to survive without depending on others or allowing others to depend on him. The idea of marriage, of binding himself to another person's fate, went against everything he had taught himself about survival in an unforgiving world. Yet something about Isabella's situation struck a chord deep within him. Perhaps it was recognition of his own vulnerability, his own history of being at the mercy of circumstances beyond his control. The auction itself was a grotesque affair, held in the back room of the saloon with an air of barely concealed shame. The auctioneer, a portly man with tobacco-stained teeth, spoke of the women as though they were livestock, emphasizing their domestic skills and physical attributes while glossing over the humanity and dignity they possessed. Marcus stood in the back of the room, his jaw clenched with disgust, as man after man bid on these desperate souls with the casual indifference of purchasing cattle. When Isabella was brought forward, the room fell into a different kind of quiet. Even in her worn dress and exhausted state, she possessed an undeniable presence that seemed to challenge the very nature of the proceedings. She kept her chin raised and her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, refusing to acknowledge the men who examined her as though she were merchandise. In that moment, Marcus saw something in her that he recognized from his own battles with adversity, a core of steel that refused to be broken, no matter how dire the circumstances. The bidding began at $50, a sum that represented several weeks' wages for most men in attendance. Marcus watched as the amount climbed steadily, driven by men whose intentions were clearly less than honorable. At $125, only 3 bidders remained, and Marcus felt a growing sense of urgency that he couldn't quite explain. When the bid reached $150, nearly all of his remaining savings, he heard his own voice calling out before his mind had fully processed the decision. $200. The room fell silent, and Isabella's eyes found his for the first time. In that brief moment of connection, Marcus saw something that took his breath away, not gratitude, exactly, but a flash of recognition, as though she understood that his bid was motivated by something other than the base desires that drove the other men. The auctioneer called for higher bids, but the amount was beyond what most men were willing or able to pay. When the gavel fell, Marcus found himself the legal guardian of another human being, bound by a contract that was as morally questionable as it was legally binding. The transaction was completed with a cold efficiency that left Marcus feeling sick to his stomach. Isabella was handed over to him like a piece of property, along with a marriage certificate that had been pre-signed by a justice of the peace. The whole arrangement was designed to provide a veneer of legitimacy to what was essentially human trafficking, and Marcus felt the weight of his complicity in the system even as he told himself he was trying to help. As they left the saloon together, walking through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge under a canopy of brilliant stars, neither Marcus nor Isabella spoke. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of their shared predicament. Marcus had acted on impulse, driven by a mixture of compassion and something else he couldn't quite name, but now he found himself facing the reality of what he had done. He had purchased another human being, regardless of his intentions, and the moral implications of that act weighed heavily on his conscience. Isabella, for her part, seemed lost in her own thoughts as they made their way to Marcus's modest cabin on the outskirts of town. She had spent weeks dreading this moment, knowing that her circumstances would eventually force her into a situation she couldn't control. Yet something about Marcus was different from what she had expected. He walked beside her rather than ahead of her, and he made no attempt to touch her or assert the rights that the marriage contract theoretically gave him. The cabin itself was spartanly furnished but clean and well-maintained. Marcus had built it himself during his first weeks in Cedar Ridge, and it reflected his practical nature. Everything had a purpose, and nothing was wasted on decoration or comfort. As they entered, Marcus gestured toward the bedroom and spoke his first words since leaving the saloon. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Isabella turned to study him, her dark eyes searching his face for some clue to his intentions. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly. "Why did you pay so much for someone you don't even know?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the cold fireplace as he considered her question. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "Seemed like the wrong thing was happening, and I couldn't just stand by and watch it. So you bought me instead." The words hung between them like an accusation, and Marcus felt their sting. "I know how it looks," he said. "I know what I did makes me part of something ugly. But, I swear to you, I won't. I don't expect anything from you. This can be whatever you want it to be." Isabella studied him for several more moments before speaking again. "What I want," she said slowly, "is to understand what kind of man spends his life savings on a stranger and, then, offers to sleep on the floor." Marcus looked up at her then, and, for the first time since entering the cabin, their eyes truly met. "Maybe a man who knows what it's like to be at the mercy of other people's choices," he said. "Maybe a man who's tired of feeling helpless. Or maybe," Isabella said softly, "a man who's still looking for something he lost a long time ago." Her words struck him with unexpected force, touching on something deep within him that he had tried to bury years ago. There was a perceptiveness in her observation that unnerved him, as though she could see through the careful walls he had built around his emotions. As the night wore on, they found themselves sitting by the fire Marcus had built, sharing a simple meal and tentative conversation. Isabella told him about her life in Pennsylvania, where she had worked as a schoolteacher until budget cuts eliminated her position. She spoke of her decision to answer the advertisement that had brought her west, a choice born of desperation and the naive hope that she might find a new beginning in the territories. Marcus, in turn, shared fragments of his own story, his childhood on the failed ranch, his years of wandering from job to job, and his growing sense that he had somehow lost sight of who he was meant to be. As he spoke, he found himself revealing things he had never told another soul, as though Isabella's presence had somehow unlocked something in him that had been sealed away. You said you were tired of feeling helpless, Isabella observed as the fire began to burn low. But, tonight, you chose to act. That doesn't sound helpless to me. Marcus considered her words carefully. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I just found something worth feeling helpless about. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the cabin windows, something fundamental had shifted between them. The formal distance that had characterized their initial interaction had given way to something more complex and infinitely more meaningful. Isabella had begun to see past Marcus's gruff exterior to the wounded but honorable man beneath, while Marcus had discovered in Isabella not just beauty and intelligence, but a strength and wisdom that challenged his assumptions about what it meant to need another person. It was Isabella who spoke first as the sun climbed higher in the sky. I've been thinking about what you said last night, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. About this arrangement being whatever I want it to be. Marcus turned to face her, his heart beginning to race with anticipation and fear in equal measure. What if what I want, Isabella continued, is to make this marriage real? Not because I have to, not because circumstances force it, but because I choose it. Because I choose you. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were unwanted, but because they represented something he had never dared to hope for. Isabella, he said carefully, you don't owe me anything. You don't have to, I know I don't have to, she interrupted. That's exactly the point. For the first time since I left Pennsylvania, I'm in a position to choose. And I'm choosing to claim you as my husband, if you'll have me. Marcus stared at her, overwhelmed by the courage it must have taken for her to make such a declaration. Here was a woman who had been reduced to the level of property just hours before, and yet she had found the strength not just to survive, but to transform her circumstances through sheer force of will. In claiming him as her husband, she was asserting her own agency and dignity in a way that rendered the previous night's transaction meaningless. I'd be honored, Marcus said finally, his voice thick with emotion. But I need you to know that I'm not the same man who walked into that auction last night. You've changed something in me, Isabella. You've reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten. Isabella moved closer to him, her hand reaching up to touch his face gently. Maybe that's what marriage is supposed to be, she said. Two people helping each other remember who they really are. The transformation that began in those dawn hours was not an overnight miracle, but rather the beginning of a long and sometimes difficult journey. Marcus had to learn to let down the walls he had built around his heart, to trust in something beyond his own ability to survive alone. Isabella had to overcome not just the trauma of her recent experiences, but the deeper wounds left by a lifetime of being told that her value lay primarily in her ability to serve others. In the weeks that followed, their relationship deepened and evolved in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Marcus began to see that true strength wasn't just about enduring hardship alone, but about having the courage to build something meaningful with another person. Isabella discovered that her intelligence and education, qualities that had often made her feel like an outsider in her previous life, were not only valued by Marcus but essential to their shared vision of what their life together could become. The town of Cedar Ridge, initially skeptical of the arrangement between the mysterious drifter and the woman he had purchased, began to see them as a genuinely devoted couple. Marcus threw himself into making their homestead profitable, while Isabella used her teaching skills to educate the children of local families, earning both respect and much-needed income for their household. But, perhaps more importantly, they both began to understand the deeper truth that had drawn them together in that saloon, that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from conquering our weaknesses, but from finding someone who helps us see our weaknesses as opportunities for growth. Marcus learned that his lifelong struggle with feeling powerless had actually prepared him to recognize and respond to powerlessness in others. Isabella discovered that her experiences of being undervalued and dismissed had given her an extraordinary capacity for seeing the potential in people that others overlooked. As autumn turned to winter, their relationship continued to deepen and strengthen. The marriage that had begun as a legal fiction became an emotional reality as they faced together the challenges of building a life in the unforgiving frontier environment. They weathered early blizzards, equipment failures, and the constant uncertainty that characterized life in the territories, but, through it all, they maintained the connection that had first sparked in those dawn hours after the auction. Marcus found himself changing in ways he had never thought possible. The man who had once prided himself on needing nothing, and no one began to understand that his greatest strength lay not in his independence, but in his willingness to build something larger than himself with Isabella. He learned to share not just his resources and his space, but his fears, his dreams, and his deepest vulnerabilities. Isabella, meanwhile, discovered that her decision to claim Marcus as her husband had been more than just a survival strategy. It had been an act of extraordinary courage that had unlocked possibilities she had never dared to imagine. In Marcus, she found not just security and protection, but a true partner who valued her mind as much as her companionship. The winter months tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Food was scarce, the cold was brutal, and the isolation was sometimes overwhelming. But these challenges also provided opportunities for them to discover just how well they worked together as a team. Marcus's practical skills and physical strength complemented Isabella's intelligence and resourcefulness, while her emotional intelligence helped him navigate the complex social dynamics of frontier life. As spring arrived, bringing with it new hope and new possibilities, Marcus and Isabella found themselves looking back on the events that had brought them together with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. What had begun as a desperate transaction in a smoke-filled saloon had become something neither of them could have imagined: a marriage based not on obligation or convenience, but on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared purpose. The story of their unusual courtship became something of a legend in Cedar Ridge and the surrounding territories. People spoke of the woman who had transformed herself from purchased property to equal partner in a single night, and of the man who had learned that true strength came not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand with someone else. But for Marcus and Isabella, the real significance of their story lay not in its dramatic beginning, but in the quiet daily reality of building a life together. They had both learned that the most profound transformations often happen not in moments of crisis, but in the accumulation of small choices made day after day, week after week, month after month. Marcus came to understand that his purchase of Isabella had been motivated not by a desire to possess her, but by a deep recognition of something in her that matched something in himself: a refusal to accept defeat, a determination to find meaning and dignity even in the most degrading circumstances. In choosing to spend his life savings to remove her from that situation, he had been acting not as a buyer, but as someone who recognized a kindred spirit in distress. Isabella, for her part, realized that her decision to claim Marcus as her husband had been an intuitive recognition of his true character. Beneath the weathered exterior and gruff manner, she had seen a man of genuine integrity who was struggling with his own sense of displacement and purposelessness. Her choice to bind her life to his had been an act of faith in both of them, faith that they could help each other become the people they were meant to be. The second part of their story began in earnest as the seasons changed and their understanding of each other deepened. The initial phase of their relationship had been about survival and basic compatibility. Now they faced the more complex challenge of building something lasting and meaningful together. Marcus began to open up about the deeper wounds that had shaped his wandering existence. He spoke of his father's gradual decline after losing the ranch, and of his own sense of guilt for being unable to save the family legacy. He revealed his fear that he was fundamentally unable to put down roots, that something in his nature would always drive him to keep moving rather than building something permanent. Isabella listened to these confessions with the patience and understanding that had first drawn Marcus to her. Rather than trying to minimize his fears or offer easy reassurance, she helped him examine them honestly and work through the beliefs about himself that had kept him isolated for so long. "You talk about being unable to build something permanent," she observed one evening as they sat together planning improvements to their homestead. "But look around you. Look at what you've built here, not just the cabin and the fences and the cleared land, but the relationships with our neighbors, the reputation you've earned for honest dealing, the life we're creating together. That doesn't look like the work of a man who can't put down roots." Marcus considered her words carefully, as he had learned to do over the months of their marriage. "Maybe I've been confusing the fear of losing something with the inability to build it in the first place," he said slowly. "Maybe," Isabella agreed. "Or maybe you needed to find something worth the risk of losing." These conversations became a regular part of their life together, as they helped each other work through the accumulated disappointments and false beliefs that had shaped their individual journeys. Isabella shared her own struggles with feeling valued only for her domestic skills and physical attractiveness, and her determination to create a life where her intelligence and education were equally important. Together, they began to envision a future that extended beyond their own immediate needs and desires. Isabella revived her dream of establishing a proper school in Cedar Ridge, while Marcus began to consider the possibility of expanding their homestead into a larger operation that could provide employment and stability for other families in the area. These shared dreams gave their relationship a forward momentum that carried them through the inevitable difficulties and setbacks of frontier life. When Marcus injured his back in a logging accident and was unable to work for several weeks, Isabella took over the physical labor of maintaining their property while continuing her teaching responsibilities. When a late frost destroyed their first major crop, wiping out months of work and investment, Marcus threw himself into finding alternative sources of income while Isabella used her connections in the community to arrange for assistance and supplies. Through each challenge, they discovered new aspects of each other's character and new depths to their own relationship. Marcus learned that his protective instincts toward Isabella were matched by her fierce loyalty to him and their shared goals. Isabella found that Marcus's practical wisdom and steady temperament provided exactly the kind of foundation she needed to pursue her more ambitious dreams. As their second year together progressed, the transformation that had begun in both of them became increasingly visible to the outside world. Marcus, who had arrived in Cedar Ridge as a solitary drifter with no apparent stake in the community's future, became known as one of the most reliable and civic-minded citizens in the territory. He served on the committee that planned the construction of a new church, contributed both labor and funds to the effort to improve the main road through town, and mentored younger men who were struggling to establish themselves in the area. Isabella's influence was equally significant. Her informal school grew into a formal educational institution that served families from a radius of 20 miles around Cedar Ridge. She organized cultural events that brought the scattered community together, established a lending library using books donated by families throughout the territory, and became known as someone who could mediate disputes and offer wise counsel to those facing difficult decisions. But, perhaps most importantly, their marriage became a model for other couples in the area, a demonstration that true partnership was possible even in the challenging environment of the frontier. Other women began to look to Isabella as an example of how to maintain their own identity and pursue their own goals within the context of marriage, while men found in Marcus a different kind of masculine ideal, one that emphasized building and nurturing rather than simply enduring and conquering. The third and most profound phase of their story began in their third year together, as they faced a crisis that tested everything they had built and learned about each other. A severe drought struck the territory that summer, followed by an early winter that caught everyone unprepared. Crops failed across the region, livestock died, and many families faced the choice between abandoning their homesteads or facing almost certain starvation. The community that Marcus and Isabella had worked so hard to build and strengthen was suddenly in danger of complete collapse. It was during this crisis that the true depth of their transformation became apparent. Rather than retreating into self-preservation mode, as the old Marcus might have done, they threw themselves into organizing community-wide relief efforts. Isabella used her teaching connections to arrange for supplies from more prosperous areas, while Marcus coordinated the sharing of resources and the collective effort to help the most vulnerable families survive the winter. The work was exhausting and sometimes heartbreaking. They opened their own home to two families who had lost everything, stretching their own limited resources to the breaking point. Marcus took on additional work hauling supplies and helping with emergency repairs, often working 16-hour days in brutal conditions. Isabella organized communal meals and childcare arrangements that allowed other women to contribute to the relief efforts while ensuring that children's needs were met. Through it all, their partnership deepened and strengthened in ways that surprised even them. They learned to communicate with few words, to anticipate each other's needs and responses, and to provide emotional support even when they were both pushed to their physical and mental limits. The crisis stripped away any remaining pretense or superficiality in their relationship, revealing the bedrock of trust and commitment that had been growing between them since that first dawn together. "I keep thinking about that night at the auction," Isabella said one evening as they sat exhausted by their fireplace, surrounded by the sleeping forms of the children they were sheltering. "About how we both ended up there because we felt like we had no choices left." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. And now here we are, in the middle of another situation where it feels like there might not be any good choices, but we're not alone in it. More than that, Isabella continued. We're not just surviving it, we're choosing how to face it. We're deciding what kind of people we want to be in the middle of it. The insight crystallized something that had been growing in Marcus's understanding for months. You know what I think happened that night? He said. I think we both recognized something in each other that we'd lost sight of in ourselves. You saw that I was someone who would act to help others, even when it cost me everything. I saw that you were someone who would find a way to claim agency even in the most powerless situation. And we've been reminding each other of those things ever since, Isabella added. As the harsh winter gradually gave way to spring, and the immediate crisis passed, Marcus and Isabella found themselves looking back on the experience as a turning point in their relationship and in their understanding of themselves. They had faced the kind of challenge that destroyed many marriages and broke apart many communities, and they had emerged from it stronger, more connected, and more certain of their shared values and goals. The drought and its aftermath had also clarified for them the nature of the life they wanted to build together. They no longer thought in terms of simple survival or even individual success, but in terms of what they could contribute to the creation of a community that could weather future crises and provide opportunities for all its members to thrive. Over the following years, this vision became the driving force behind their continued development as individuals and as a couple. Marcus's business ventures increasingly focused on projects that would benefit the entire community: a general store that provided fair prices and extended credit during difficult times, a freight service that connected isolated homesteads with markets in larger towns, and eventually a cattle operation that provided both employment and a reliable source of meat for local families. Isabella's educational work expanded beyond the classroom to include adult literacy programs, vocational training for young women, and advocacy for policies that would support family stability in the territories. She also began writing, documenting both the practical challenges of frontier life and the stories of the remarkable people who were building new communities in the wilderness. Their marriage, which had begun with Marcus purchasing Isabella at an auction, had evolved into something that neither of them could have imagined during those first uncertain hours together. They had become true partners in every sense: intellectually, emotionally, and practically. Each had helped the other overcome the limitations and fears that had previously constrained their lives, and together they had created something larger and more meaningful than either could have achieved alone. Marcus had learned that the strength he had always prized, the ability to endure hardship alone, was actually a form of weakness when compared to the courage required to build something lasting with another person. His willingness to remain vulnerable and open with Isabella, even when it felt dangerous, had allowed him to become the kind of man he had always wanted to be but had never known how to become. Isabella had discovered that her intellectual gifts and strong will were not obstacles to finding love and partnership, but rather the very qualities that made her an ideal partner for a man who was brave enough to appreciate them. Her decision to claim Marcus as her husband had been more than just a desperate gambit. It had been an assertion of her right to choose her own destiny and to find someone worthy of the life she had to offer. As they entered their 5th year together, both Marcus and Isabella understood that their story was not really about the dramatic circumstances that had brought them together, but about the daily choice to continue growing and changing in response to each other's presence in their lives. The auction that had brought them together had been a single moment, but their marriage was an ongoing act of creation, renewed and deepened with each passing day. The man who had purchased her had indeed been transformed by Dawn, but not because Isabella had somehow claimed ownership of him. Instead, she had seen and called forth the best aspects of his character, just as he had provided her with the safety and support she needed to become fully herself. Together, they had learned the truth that would guide them through all the challenges and joys of their life together, that the man who destroys his weak self, not through isolation and self-reliance, but through the courage to grow and change in partnership with another, can indeed never be destroyed by others. Their love story became a testament to the possibility of transformation, even in the harshest and most unforgiving circumstances. It stood as proof that sometimes the most profound change comes not from conquering our weaknesses, but from finding someone who helps us transform them into strengths. And it demonstrated that true strength lies not in the ability to stand alone, but in the courage to build something beautiful and lasting with another person who was brave enough to undertake the same journey of growth and discovery. In the end, Marcus Kane and Isabella Rodriguez had found in each other not just companionship or security, but the catalysts for becoming the people they were always meant to be. Their marriage, born from the ashes of desperate circumstances, had become a beacon of hope for others who struggled to believe that love and partnership were possible even in the most challenging environments. They had proven that with courage, commitment, and the willingness to remain open to transformation, any two people could create something extraordinary together, something that honored both their individual dignity and their shared dreams for the future.